Hi, and welcome to a Skill Me Up Expert Talk session on Windows Virtual Desktop. My name is Kit Skinner. I'll be your presenter today. A couple things about me. I have a MCSE going back to the old NT4 days, a Azure Cloud Architect. I've been doing IT for about 20 plus years, 15 years in IT, doing various internal roles, and a little over 6 years doing Azure consulting and training. So just a little bit about me. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or look me up on LinkedIn if you're interested. All right, in today's sessions, we're going to go over just a brief overview of what Virtual Desktop is, since that's what Windows Virtual Desktop is aiming to facilitate, and just a little history overview. Then we're going to do a deeper dive into Windows Virtual Desktop structure in Azure and some of the deeper different pieces of it. We're going to then cover the deployment methods for getting host pools out and updated in Azure, and then we're going to go over some of the future goals of Windows of WVD as well as where it's all headed. Finally, we're going to go into a quick demo, so time's permitting. As always, if you have any questions during this talk, feel free to bring them up at any time in the chat window or unmute your mic. We'll also be doing some time at the end for QA if anybody's needing some more questions. All right. Without further ado, let's get into this. Let's start with just a quick brief overview of what Virtual Desktop is, just to get everybody on the same page. So originally, with any environment, you just had the traditional individual workstation. That's what people would log in with, and then you brought in remote access. People logging into it. That evolved into shared servers, shared server pools because we didn't have enough resources. And then they would do remote apps, which basically give you the appearance of running an application on a local machine, even though it was actually running in a centralized server. And then they would get to internet accessible servers, so people didn't have to initially go over VPN. This was all just the basic evolutions of remote desktop terminal services, kind of in the early days, and then those, of course, based on physical servers, and then virtual servers brought in a whole new experience for everybody. We started to be able to do shared servers that were virtualized. Then the virtualization vendors started to do VDI solutions, where basically you would have a bunch of VMs where each person would get their own little VM. They'd be able to log into it and be able to utilize those. Get kind of that, and then of course the cloud came into play, and the cloud, of course, is it's growing, it's changing. Everybody's looking to move resources up to it, and so that's where Microsoft brought in their Windows Virtual Desktop solution as a place to be able to do Windows Virtual Desktops in Azure. Right, and then just kind of a summary of all of the pieces of VDI within just any virtual desktop environment. There's a few key pieces that are just universal throughout. You always start with a client machine, whether it be a laptop, desktop, thin client, phone, whatever it is. The whole goal is that you don't really care what the client is. You just have some sort of client that's going to connect up, and it connects up to a gateway. And that gateway is where all the authentication happens. It's where you're validating that the machine's a valid device that you're connecting from. Back-end protocol negotiations, that all happens between the client and the gateway. Then once the user session has been authenticated and validated, it's allowed to reach that session back to the host. Now, again, that's coming through the gateway to the host. The client's never actually talking directly to it. Also, there's usually a broker involved in this process where it's determining which host is going to be used by the user session and just what they're going to be connecting to on the back end. This may be just a small set of servers, it may be multiple different pools, or it may be individual VMs for the machines. It just is generically a host on the back end of some kind, depending on your implementation, what that host actually is. And then also in a really well-secured environment, there's firewalls between each one of those spaces. So we make sure that the client is only talking to the gateway is only talking to the host. There's very limited protocols that are talking at each different level. We make sure there's not any hopscotching. We make sure that we're only doing what we expect between those different environments. So it makes it a nice, good, isolated setup. And then on the back end, all user sessions are combined of three core pieces. You have the operating system, the application, the user profiles. All those are then brought together to bring up the actual user session, their environment. And in any VDI solution, this is pretty much the core pieces. And depending on how those last three, the OS, the app, and the user session are brought together, determines what your scalability and portability are going to be for those different areas. All right. So with the traditional VDI definitions out of the way and what actually VDI is, let's kind of just focus on WVD implementation within Azure and what it actually is. So as with everything in Azure, WVD is structured along the shared responsibility model. However, it doesn't really sit real well in one area. There's a lot of times different solutions. They'll be in maybe IaaS for most of it, or SaaS. For those of you that are familiar with the infrastructure as a service for SaaS, but WVD really goes across multiple different ones. And at the core, even just a base setup, you're always going to have at least SaaS services and IaaS services. And what that means is that the gateway, the broker, all those types of edge devices and edge pieces, those are all managed and maintained completely by Azure. You don't have to monitor all those pieces. For anybody that's done a remote desktop setup, that was actually a lot of times where a lot of the problems would come in, because those are the ones that are going to be hit by people. Those are the ones that are, all the nefarious systems are going to be talking to. Also, it's where a lot of the scaling would have to work, because you're having multiple different systems coming in from different locations. And then on top of it too, a lot of times, especially the smaller environments, they would have a desktop gateway in one particular data center, and then you would have, people maybe connecting from across the world or across the country, and they would be really far away from those gateways. Well, with Azure and the global setup, and things like they have front door and the load balancers and traffic managers and all that, those pieces, WVD, they're getting more and more places throughout the globe, so that wherever somebody is, they can hit the closest WVD gateway, and that way they can get into the Azure platform and then get onto the Azure backbone as quickly as possible. So that way, when you have somebody in South Africa trying to connect to a server that happens to be in the East US, you can actually have them hit the endpoint in South Africa and then come across the Azure backbone. Obviously, there's still going to be delays, but that means that they're onto the network a little bit faster, and you don't have to worry about them going across the public internet as much. So that's a big piece that WD is bringing into place. And then on the back end, you have the actual hosts that are running the WVD environment. And these are going to be traditional VMs in Azure. The downside is that does mean that you're going to have to patch the systems, you're monitoring them, you're responsible for those operating systems. However, it also means that there's not a whole lot of new tooling that has to initially be done. You can use all the existing management pieces and all the existing environment that you have for any of your VMs that you have on premise, any Windows and monitoring tools that you have existing in Azure on premise, you can continue to use with these hosts. So you can still utilize those tools very easily. It's a very friendly environment. So a lot of times people are doing RDS, and on premise, you can actually move this pretty quickly into a WVD environment. It's a very similar type of setup for those types of things. And then also these are traditional VMs, so they do have to join into a Active Directory domain services. Now they can be Azure ADDS, but they can't do direct Azure AD joins. Even though we now have Windows 10 multi-session in WVD, which is another thing we'll talk about in a little bit, you still can't join them directly to Azure AD. So you're still going to have some DS of some kind up there. All right, so that's a shared service model. This is how WVD has been designed and structured from a very early stage. And the whole goal is that, on the left, you have your RD client of any kind, whether it be a phone, a tablet, whatever. And there's native tools for Android, Mac, iOS, Windows, as well as the HTML5 client. That's been a big goal from the beginning, so that it doesn't matter what client you're on. If you have an HTML5 browser, you can connect into WVD. It's not quite as seamless and as nice as one of the native tools, but it is something that at least gives you a lot of cross-platform support, so you don't have to worry about initially where they're coming from. You can usually get into it as long as you can authenticate. And then again, like I talked about before, the shared services model, these are the pieces that are going to be on the back end that you're going to be managing for any of your deployments. You're still going to have your desktops, your apps, your user profiles, your Active Directory. And then on the outside, you have your traditional Azure management. And then here in the middle is where all the features that WVD is bringing into it is the web access, the diagnostics, the gateway, the broker, all those pieces that they're managing so that you don't have to initially worry about those different pieces. Okay. All right. Now, these are the core pieces of WVD. We kind of talked about a little bit in the previous slide. Um, but the main thing that you're going to be looking at whenever you're looking at any WVD is that you have your workspace, and within your workspace, you have host pools, and within those host pools, you have your app groups, and then within your app groups, you have your actual applications. And this is how WVD is just structured: is that you have your VMs that are running within the host pool. They have their app groups, and you can have the apps go to different app groups. You can have multiple applications per app groups. However, each app group only belongs to one host pool, and each host pool only belongs to one workspace. But you can have multiple host app groups per host pool, multiple host pools per workspace. And so this is how you can generally think about the design of any type of WVD setup. Also, by default, there's what's called the desktop application group. This gets created within the host pool, and that's what gives you direct access to the desktop if you don't want to use the remote app services. That's where you have over on the side here, and that's the only thing that appears here. You also are going to only allow to have one desktop application group per host pool, and really makes a lot of sense to only have one because you're just going to remote desktop into it. The workspace is also how it's presented to the user. So any of the space that they are listed out, they're always going to show within a workspace. That's where the icons are going to be grouped together in the user's client. And then the applications are going to be listed as icons. So if you just give them access to the DAG, then they're only going to see the desktop icon. If you give them access to the app groups, then they'll be listed here. And that's the key pieces of WVD. And then Azure AD is obviously a very big piece of any WVD deployment. And you need both the Azure AD services and the traditional domain services, and then connected via Azure AD Connect as a key portion of it. And the file shares and your profile containers. Last year, they bought I guess a little over a year ago, they bought FS Logics to do the containerization. That makes it to where the profiles are much easier to move around. If you ever had to deal with roaming profiles in the past or other types of profile issues, the FS Logic, which is included with WVD, solves a lot of those issues. All right. So again, the hosts, part of the host pools, they connect to traditional domain services, well, file servers. However, all the app groups and how they have access into the different workspaces is handled by Azure AD. And so that's where those pieces have to be synced and they have to be continuous between them. So you have to make sure that you're using Azure AD Connect and that your IDs match up between the two different environments. All right, so with the WVD structure out of the way and the different pieces of WVD, let's talk a little bit about the deployments. So whenever you go to do a deployment within WVD and Azure, there's two different types of pools that you're going to run into. You have pooled and personal. And you're going to hear yourself say pooled pool periodically, but it's just part of the terminology. But the idea between pooled versus personal is that the personal is that the VM is dedicated to one user account, one user session. You can either have it dedicated to that user so that anytime the user comes back, they always log into that same VM, or you can have it non-dedicated, in which case just the next time a user logs in, it gets it. That's within a personal pool. But then you also have the pooled environment, which is more what you're used to in a traditional desktop terminal services environment, where you have a pool of VMs and multiple users connect to it with multiple sessions. The idea being is that the pooled environment is usually a more efficient use of resources because you're not having to pay for one VM per each person. Um, and therefore you can have some shared resources. Also, auto scaling solution can drastically reduce the costs. The idea behind auto scaling is that you're looking at what your utilization of the resources are, and you're either spinning down or spinning up VMs to account for that. And so that way, if you don't have a whole lot of people logged in, you have your machine spun down, deallocated, and Azure's not charging you for compute costs. However, if you start seeing a bunch of people log in, you can spin up some additional VMs so that you can make sure they have the performance available to them so they can continue to work in an efficient way. Personal is, again, where it's dedicated to the user. And these are really mostly for power users, high-end compute needs, maybe with security concerns around it, where you want to have each person maybe have their own isolated environment. But it gets a little bit pricey. So it's something you need to make sure of. You also want to make sure that you have like shutdown schedules or monitoring, when they're actually used. So again, you can minimize the cost. The idea being is that if you have 50 VMs, they're even running it, relatively cheap for the small users. That can add up if you just leave them running 24/7. But if you could maybe scale them back after hours, or if you notice that nobody's been logged into the machine for a day and a half or something, just shut it down, and then they can be spun back up later when the users actually need them. So that's kind of some of the ideas behind the two different pools. And then when you want to go out and do the next bit is the actual sizing of the pools, how you figure out what you're actually going to need to be scaling for. So when you're designing it out, there's 4 main levels that they look at for scoping it. And we're going to circle back around with some of the future tech where this is going to be a big thing. But if you can identify what type of users you're going to be using and try and scale your host pools around that, rather than initially applications for departments, but actually the size of the systems, that can actually help with some of the future technologies coming out. Because the whole goal is that you can have a host pool of light users where you have 6 users per CPU. Now, when they say light users, they really mean light users. It's like maybe connecting to a web browser or a basic simple app, something very easy and lightweight. Because 6 users per CPU is very light. So there's got to be a lot of sharing of the processors around it. Medium is where you're going to start to get into like just your basic office apps. Somebody's just looking at Word, looking at basic Excel spreadsheets, doing very minor systems, maybe doing Outlook on there. You don't want to have a whole lot of heavy users necessarily in that environment, but heavy is where you start to get into people using large spreadsheets. Maybe they're doing some image or file editing. You're looking at people who are doing just a little bit more intensive work, and that's where you're taking around 2 users per CPU. And then finally, the power user, where basically you don't want to go more than 1 user per CPU. This is also something you want to try and plan ahead of time what you're going to be looking at, but you can change this down the road. You're not logged into one size when you deploy your host pool. You can come back and change those sizes of the VMs, just like any other VM in Azure, because they are just Azure VMs. So change their size and reboot them. Requires obviously a small outage because it does require you to reboot the server, but you're not actually stuck to it. But at the same time, you don't want to necessarily be rebooting them all the time. And then also you can scale out and add additional VMs for it, but that means that you're going to be increasing your costs. So you really want to try and figure out what your real usage is. You want to try and plan out for what your peak is going to be, but you want to figure out if your users are more, light users, not really doing much, medium users, which basically just general office standard apps, heavy users where you get in like a little bit larger systems, and the power users again, really intensive usage. Because once you identify those settings as to whether you're going to do pooled, personal, or heavy, light, medium, whatever type of users they are, then basically you can just do some math to figure out how many VMs you're going to need in what size. basically just start off with the number of concurrent users and then the users per CPU, which again is defined by light, medium, high, and that just tells you how many CPUs you need. Then once you have how many CPUs you need, then you're looking at the virtual CPUs, how many you need, and then that tells you how many hosts you're going to have in each pool. So it's just a quick mathematical process is all that I'm talking about here. And then when you go to actually do your deployments, these are the main pieces that are going to be whenever you're doing your deployments. You have your host pool, which is again your Azure Resource Manager templates are based on these. The additional host VMs can be deployed at any time from the same source image. So if you again deploy 2 VMs and realize that okay, we're actually growing enough where we need a third, you can actually go back and just redeploy and it'll spin up a third system. And that's all based around your host pools. They should all be the same size. And again, like I said, you can change the size, but you should change them all at once. You shouldn't necessarily have just this one size and the other two not. You'll run into scaling issues. You'll run into people having poor performance one way or the other. They need all be the same size within a host pool, but they can be changed. In the scope of custom settings. So if you want to enable like clipboard devices, special audio settings, all that's at the host pool level. That's not done any lower to individual machines or connections. It's all done at the host pool level. And then you have your application groups. This is where you actually assign the users. Like I talked about in the previous slide, this is where you assign who's going to have access to what. You always have the desktop app that's in there by default. Your application groups you can add at any time. It doesn't matter how many people are logged in. It doesn't have any interruption. You're just adding a definition really that's going to go in there. And then once you assign it to them, they can update their subscription and the icons will appear for them immediately. There's almost no delay for setting up an application group. You can have multiple application groups per host pool. You don't have to have any limit really there. All the applications need to be on all the hosts in the host pool. So just because you've installed it to one system, if you go in and install an application after the fact, it may not be available to all the users. So you need to make sure that whatever application you're going to publish is on all the hosts in the host pool. If you're doing image deployments, that shouldn't be a big deal. There's also some other tech that we're talking about that'll help you with that. But the big thing is that any application you put in the application group needs to be available on all hosts in the host pool. And then also, if you don't add the application group to your workspace, it's not going to show up to the users. So this is something if you want to stage things, if you want to get things ready before you actually publish an application, if you don't add to the workspace, it won't show up in the into the end users yet. So that's one way you can kind of stage things and get them out there. In the workspace, again, it's the visual separation for the user. We'll show this in the demo a little bit, but this is how it identifies it. What workspace and what the users are in there. And then each host pool can only belong to one of the workspaces. So again, you can have multiple different host pools in each workspace, but each workspace is going to have each one. Now, people always ask, how should you set up your workspace? And usually it's around how you're structuring your organization or maybe your solution. A lot of times people will have, in large corporations, they may have separate subsidiaries, and so they have different separations and solutions for each one of them. So maybe you have company A where they have their own set of host pools, and then company B and their own another set of host pools, and so that way it can be clearly delineated when somebody logs in that maybe spans both organizations. They can actually see the separation of okay, I'm logging into company A's Word app, I'm logging into company B's desktop solution, whatever it is. Then the other thing a lot of times is different departments for HR, especially they'll find out that they want to have a particular application that is limited only to people within HR, and so they'll set up a workspace for HR, have different security around it, and that way people know when they're logging in, it's clearly going into HR, and will have its own restrictions around that. Also, if somebody isn't a member of an application group within a workspace, they won't even see the workspace. So that's another piece of it. And then sources. You can have multiple different places for the images that come from the host pools. But it's very important that you define how you're going to build your images for your host pools, because when you want to deploy new hosts in the future, in any host pool, it's going to pull from the same image source wherever it happened to be. And you can't really change that once you've deployed the host pool. Now, the idea behind the host pool is that you can always come back and deploy a new host pool, and users can log into the new host pool. So you could always develop an image, deploy a system, add users to it, and you could come back and build a brand new image, and deploy a new host pool to it, have users log into that one, and get rid of the old host pool. It can be a very cyclical type of system. But if you set up your host pools to be either a custom image or even preferably from a shared image gallery, when you want to redeploy your system, or if you want to do an update, you can just update that image that they're sourced from and go to deploy new hosts. They'll grab that new version. When they grab that new version, now the users can immediately start to get the new features in the new host. You can slowly spin down the original servers. Um, it allows them to be able to spin up just dynamically. Don't have to actually interrupt user sessions. You can tell them gracefully, hey, log off to get the new updates. You can set up to where they only log into the newer system. But the idea behind it is that you have some sort of image that you update. Custom images are basically you've just built out an image. You either from your on-premise Hyper-V or up in Azure, and you built a VM and you built an image and you just stick it out there. And if you put it into the storage account, you can update that file, that blob that's in that storage account, and every time you do a deployment, it's going to go out and pull that blob. And that's one way that you can get those updates. A shared image gallery, however, allows you to put versioned images into a gallery, and it will keep track of each one of those individual images. So every time you make a new deployment, you put it out there. And one of the things that we need to talk about when we're doing WVD is the type of how you get updates out to the systems. And if you are doing things like patching the systems or deploying updates to the systems, you can do those just like you do any other VM. But the problem becomes that how do you know when you're logged in? You got the maintenance windows, you have multiple people logged in accessing the application, so you can't necessarily update files because they're locked by users. And that's where in a shared environment, um, you run into problems of getting those patches into it. Plus, you have so many different dependencies and so many different applications in there. And if you update one application, it doesn't have a problem with another one. So when you have a shared system like that, where you have so many people log in, so determined on it, what a lot of people actually choose to do instead is just push the updates via the images. So anytime that you have a patch, major update for your operating system, you can just go in there, make the changes to image, capture that image, put it into your shared image gallery, deploy a new host, and now those patches are updated. And then you get rid of the old hosts. Now, as we talked about earlier, we have containers where we have our profiles. And I just glanced about that just briefly. But because those are now kept off in different shared environments, if they log into a new host, they get that new profile. It doesn't matter what system they logged into, they're getting all those files that they had in their profile and all their settings. So we've spun up new servers. They log into the new servers. They still get their same profiles, but it's already patched. And again, this is something you can do pretty gracefully with the WVD environment. We're going to talk a little bit more about image builder and some of the process we can do to do that. But the idea behind this is that you want to try and get to using a shared image gallery or a custom image gallery. Marketplace images are good for if you just want to test something, you just want to get basic details on there. But the only thing that they have available in the Microsoft one is just Microsoft 365, just Office. So it doesn't really give you a whole lot, but it's good just to be able to test it out. And it's also what you want to usually build your systems from, your base images from, anyways. All right. So when you're actually deploying your system, you now have three main ways. And yeah, you'll hear a lot of times the Spring 20 update, the Spring 2020 update, or sometimes even just the Spring update. That was a big change in the WVD environments. If you had ever used WVD before April, you were having to do things through PowerShell. You're having to do a lot of environment stuff where either using a third-party tool for management. It was, outside the realm. You had to individually use it. A very cumbersome environment. After the Spring 20 update, there was a big change for WVD. It became a true Azure resource in the sense that it was integrated the portal. It had ARM template setups. It had Azure PowerShell pieces. It was all, first year environment. So doing it through the Azure portal is the quickest way for a user, as far as somebody who's never used any of the command line tools or ARM templates, but it's kind of time consuming because you're having to click through a whole bunch of environments. Command line's really repeatable, but it's very linear. It's difficult to do all the hosts at once. A lot of times it's not bad, but it's not really the preferred method. If you can set up with ARM templates, if you've ever done Azure deployments, and we've got some courses on that. If you haven't, it's a really good, efficient way to do those deployments is with an ARM template. But some people find it kind of cryptic. It's easiest if you can just pull from an existing resource, an existing template, and just go ahead and do your deployments that way. But the ARM templates is going to be your best bet long term if you're going to be doing a lot of these deployments, or any type of orchestration. If you want to use, Terraform, or Chef, or any of the other deployment methods, you can integrate with those as well. But I would definitely look at one of those types of solutions rather than just doing through the portal. The portal's nice for setting up and monitoring, but you don't have to do a deployment every single time if you want to go out there. All right. And kind of go into the portal in a little bit, but right now let's just talk about what's upcoming. So recently they just went back to doing auto scaling through the Azure automation runbooks. That was something that was long needed with the Spring update, but they just released this past month. It allows you to schedule the start for the VMs, stop them during off-peak hours, look at the number of sessions per CPU core, and kind of scale them, down when off-peak hours. It's a really great advantage when you're doing a pulled environment to make sure that you have the optimal number of VMs running to cut down your costs and minimize your loads on those systems. And then it already integrates with log analytics, but the reports are kind of lacking. So you can start collecting your data right now, but there's a lot of community-driven pieces to help you build out some monitor pieces, but there's not really a true monitor solution for WVD. But there's a lot of third parties that are filling in these gaps. There's great tools and great community pieces out there that will give you a lot of those details. So even though it's not a quick package in Azure, there is a ton of information that you get. Also diagnostic logs. You can see performance and trees in there. You can get a lot of those statistics from people getting connected in the environment. But one thing to keep in mind is that WVD, the Spring update, is technically preview still. You'll still see that preview all over the place because they're changing things left and right. They are growing. So this is a very fast and moving target, but it's very well supported, and a lot of great features are coming out there. But the scaling and monitoring is a really key piece for keeping your costs down. If you go just to deploy a host and have all your hosts running all the time, it'll work. It'll work great. You're going to pay for it. So you really want to look at the auto scaling and monitoring pieces that are out there and keep an eye on those as they keep evolving and coming out. Like I said, look, Microsoft publishes the partners that have these solutions out there. They recognize it's not really something they have fully fleshed out yet. I would be surprised if they start coming out with more of these soon, but there's a lot of great community solutions out there that will give it to you. Right. Now, we talked about image building, and I kind of glossed over it because I want to focus on the image builders that's coming out. This is something that is currently in preview as well. That is a really great advantage for WVD if you're going to start looking at doing this a lot. And the whole idea behind image builder is that you just basically have this workflow process that you can automate so that you can look to do updates for your images. And again, they can do multiple different OSs. Obviously, Windows Virtual Desktop only does Windows images at the moment, but you just bring those in as sources. You can then have script to customize it, and then runs through the distributor that then pushes out to different places. Again, you can put it to a shared image gallery, and then it'll put it out to the VMs. And so the nice thing about this is that this gets pushed back to the image versions. The nice thing is that once you start doing this process with the image builder and you start automating these pieces, anytime you got to make an update, whether it be just updating application, performing Windows updates, whatever those pieces are, this becomes a very scripted, automated process that you can just rerun periodically. Then you put it out to the shared image gallery, you do um, create additional hosts for the host pool. You then schedule down the old systems, and then you delete those old systems, and nobody really even knows that you did an update. It becomes a very quick process. It's very reliable, and people really know how you're doing those systems. So the image builder, again, it's something that's relatively new in Azure. It's um, still in preview. But it's also based on HashiCorp's package. So anybody who's been doing Terraform or package generation with the HashiCorp solutions, this is what it's based on. That's what they're doing this on. Eventually, this is also the goal is to have this integrated directly into WVD as well. So you can start having the different pieces and start having your image builder as part of your host pools. It's not there yet. They don't have any preview of it, but they've expressed multiple times that this is something they want to start building in WVD. So if you can start learning these pieces now, it'll start helping you out on it. Now, the other big piece is the MSIX app attach. And this is something that is a very big advantage for WVD. Something that's, again, still in preview and still got some pieces that need to be added onto, but it's now supported in the 2004 version of Windows 10 multi-session, which is now supported by WVD. And the idea behind app attach, MSIX app attach, is that you have the containerization essentially, where you have your user profile right now is containerized by FSLogix. You have a disk file that's out on a file share and gets mounted by the operating system. And anytime somebody's doing writes to registry or writes to their files, it's going directly out to their profile that's kept down the share. So you have a very minimal footprint on the OS. You don't have a whole lot of profile and registry entries going directly to here. It's almost all going out to the user profile, which is out on a shared disk. So the idea behind app attach is that we do the same type of thing, but with applications. So the idea is that you take an application, you build up its definition as far as the different pieces of the actual executable, what the registry files are going to be, registry entries are set up, and you put those all into an app file. And there's a new file format they have with it that's going to be that is read only, and by making it read only, it becomes a very fast process. And what you can do with this is that you can have your host pools defined by, again, like we talked about earlier, light, medium, and heavy. This is where it becomes a really big deal. Is that if you know that your users are just going to be a bunch of light users, you can install just a base core image, put the light users log into there, set them out to be 6 users per CPU, and then you have all their apps over in different MSIX app attach packages. When they log in, you mount those applications that they want to use. Your base OS image doesn't need to have anything on it as far as app is concerned. You just need to make sure it's set up and configured to run your security protocols and whatever settings you need, but it doesn't need to have all these apps installed into it. Then again, you do the same type of thing for your medium users and your heavy users. And so your pool really just becomes a bunch of VMs that have almost nothing installed on them. They don't have Office, they don't have Visual Studio, they don't have Adobe. It doesn't have any of those applications installed. Those are all kept in MSIX packages. So then what you only have to worry about when you're updating them is that you have to patch the OS and whatever key pieces you have on there. So you don't have to do a whole lot of maintenance on those VMs as far as changing those images. And then when you need to update a particular application, you don't have to worry about going in and changing the entire image just because there was a patch for one particular application. And you don't have to wait for your monthly rotation if there's an emergency patch. to go, wait for that monthly point where you're doing all your apps at once. You can just update the individual app. And then you put them out on the network share with the updates. And next time the user logs in, they get the new app, the patched app. And so that way, again, it all becomes containerized. And your operating systems is what your VMs are based on. This also means that any time somebody's writing to this application, it's going to be put into their user profile via the FS logic pieces. So anytime they got to make an app change, it's getting put off into the user profile, and then they can log into a different host pool or a different host, and all their settings are right there with it. If for some reason somebody needs to stop using an app, if the licensing is removed or somebody doesn't need it anymore, all you do is remove the right to run that app attach, and it's gone. They just don't see it. You don't have to worry about uninstalling the applications. Right now, traditionally, what people are having to do with their WVD environments is that they have to do a very large build image, or you install an operating system and you have the 20 different applications that they're going to use all on there. And then FS Logic and other tools will let you filter out the applications to only what they have based on what group they're in. And that's fine. They just don't see the applications that they don't have access to. But that means you have a very large footprint for your image, and you're constantly having to update and manage those. You're having to worry about the interaction between these apps. But instead, by having the app attached, that pulls it out. And what this is all leading up to is the idea that this becomes a fully containerized type of solution. You just have your host pools that you're deploying. You have your users' profiles off in the shares, and you have your applications over in their disk images. And the users log in, they mount up their profiles where all their changes take place. Nothing gets affected on the operating system. Nothing gets affected with the app image, and it's only their user profiles that are changing. By doing it, it doesn't matter where they log in then. Then you can have a host pool that maybe is over in Eastern Europe for the people that eventually, when they start moving around, they may log into the East Europe when they're in East Europe, or when they're in the West US, they log in the West US, and their profile is being moved and replicated between different areas. But because you have your applications in your local areas and your OS in the different areas, you can do your deployments of those. It becomes a very easy way to manage all these applications that are starting to grow. All right. So let's type into real quick the demo. So, right. Now, as we talked about in our session, we were talking about how there is the HTML5 web app, and again, this is available any browser that has HTML5. You can just log into this website. It's the same for every user, every client. You have this standard implementation. They get prompted for Azure AD authentication, just like what they would for any other Azure AD service, any Azure service, just like they would for Office. If they'd signed in for Office, they would initially have to be prompted for this. But just going to go ahead and log in my test user here. All right, fine. Okay, I'm starting a new session then. Well, that always fun that does that for you. All right. Let's go ahead and just do this within a private window. And then great for the demo gods always to shut this up. Typing your key password. All right, so this is the type of interface that you would see for a user when they log in for the first time. And this particular case, what I have is a host pool where this is the desktop application group, and then the Office apps are published as initial apps. Now, if they want to log into one of these, they want to run a Word app, they can just click this and go and say, I want to go and connect. And what it's actually going to do is connect back to the host pool, establishing connection. Now, you need to log in. This has a web form, so where it just popped up the first second the password that I had saved on that. It's just doing the authentication. In here, I'm going to get the Word app. It's a Word icon. Now, this particular user doesn't have a license, so just going to log in and get the basic Word environment, and then want to come back and say start up Excel app. Just starts up Excel, get access to there, get the blank workbook. Anyways, so that's the get the little icons up here for the different apps that you start them up and start using them in the different environments. And this is the way it would be for anybody who's in a traditional HTML5 web browser, the same type of setup. Okay. However, if you wanted to do the actual client with any of the supported clients out there, this particular one is Windows, but this same type of experience, whether it be Mac, iOS, Android, or whatever. You just come into this, and then there's an option to subscribe to a workspace, and you just put in the email address, just like they would for if they're setting up an Outlook profile or anything else. And again, this is done by DNS text entry, so anytime that somebody is when you're setting it up, you just put in text entry to say that they're going to be using this particular feed to get access to it. And immediately grabs the setup directly, so I don't even have to give them the URL, find it, and that sort of stuff. They just put their username, goes on, grabs it. Also, if you there's now been an update if you're in multiple organizations or multiple different environments, multiple different logins to resources and do that. But this is the way we would typically set up. And then just like I have applications over there, if I want to click down here and see Word, what you're going to see is that the session is going to be authenticated down here. And you can do the same type of thing. Now, I'm not logged in through my Windows, and I don't have any of the single sign-on. This is as if they were logging in from like their own personal workstation to the environment. But you can set up ADFS where this would all be single sign-on and show up as just a single authentication for them. See back here, I've been disconnected because I'm logging in the same host pool. And now all those applications, even though I said I wanted to start Word, because all these were in that same session, they've all been brought down here. Notice down here at the bottom, we have these the applications, and they have the little overlay of the remote app icons, the two little green arrows. And so those sessions that I had running up there have now been pulled down to the local system, and the Word app now says, hey, these have been closed out, so I don't have the icons anymore. And so now the session's down here. And that's because you really only have one session per host pool anyways. And that's what this does. It brought it down. So that way, no matter where they log into, they can be at home, they can be at work, they can be working in one session. Where they go, they log into it. Get that same session. Now, the other nice thing is that when you have these remote apps published, once I subscribed, they showed up as icons here in my start menu. So while I can pull up the remote desktop app here and pull up the icons this way, I can also close out of this and come down here and find those apps in this environment. Now I don't have any of the apps installed on my local machine. It's all within this environment. So you'll notice I have these shortcuts in here, and then go down to this grouping where it has them. Now if they wanted to, they can pin these to the taskbar. They could put them in your start menu just like they what any other normal application, and it shows up over here. And so, for instance, I want to start Word, or excuse me, OneNote. You just type in those. Oops, type your password. So, by the way, that's an authentication process in my Azure AD to do MFA, but I'm not setting that up because I don't have the license, so that's what's having some problems there. But anyways, so you'll see now I started OneNote again by just having that. And if I unsubscribe from the service because I don't want to use it anymore, it's going to disconnect my existing session. You can see over here. Now if I go down into the W's where I had that session, then the icon's now gone. So now that I haven't subscribed, it's no longer there. And this happens too with if you want to add apps to them. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I can go into a little bit more detail. Anybody have any other questions at the moment? No questions? Okay. Just to give you all a quick rundown of the portal and what that looks like from the management side. Let's bring that up. So, if anybody hasn't seen the WVD from the spring update, this is now the new host and set up within Azure, and these are where all the settings are for the new ARM setup. And here you have your host pools. You have those listed out in your application groups for the different host pools. Here you'll see you have a desktop application group as well as an office group. You can have your workspaces, the user sessions. You can go and look for existing users and see what's on there. If you go into the host pools, you'll see how many sessions or excuse me, how many hosts are available, how many active sessions there are. If there's any systems that are down for any reason, that availability gets updated. You can also go into the session host to see who the active sessions are. We talked about when you want to deploy new systems, you could have them get deployed out to it, and you could have people start stop logging into them. So in here, what you would do is you could go into the server and you could say change the drain mode to where the drain mode becomes on. And what the drain mode basically means that we're not going to let anybody else log in. We're going to deny any new connections. Then also, if you have people logged into it, you could send them a message and say, hey, log off the next 30 minutes. And they still don't log off, and give them enough warning, they can finally just log off everybody. And once you've done that, then what you can do is actually remove this from the host pool, and so that's where your patching process would be. And again, just to deploy new hosts, all you need to do is come down into your session host and click add and say you want to deploy a new one. So it's, again, all these are now hard coded, and I've done a deployment of this host pool. All these are the standard sessions, and we got to keep the same thing set up. And then we set how many virtual machines we want. And so we need to say 1, 2, 3, 4, however many you want to do. You need to make sure they're in the same region. You can't have multiple regions if you want to have them set up, but I only have the virtual network out here. Put them into a virtual network just like you would any other VM. Again, you can also script this and dynamically do it if you want to. And then the big thing is, because we're joining into a domain, you need to make sure that they have a domain on here. Now, I'm going to just type in what we have for our domain, but you could also, with a template, have this stored off in the key vault so that you could have this in a secured environment where you're cycling the password regularly, getting those updated. And when your deployments happen, all they're doing is coming out and grabbing them from this key vault. and again, tags just like you would any other standard system, and go and create. And also, we've mentioned about how we would do a template. Have a basic template out here. Where basically, we can deploy a new host pool and set up those settings in this environment. It's pulling from the defined image in the they have out there. It's a little script that basically just calls the deployment for the RGE. It's not actually doing real PowerShell. It's just using PowerShell to do the deployment. Let's kick that off. And again, just like any other standard deployment in Azure, come out and look here. You can see what the deployments are. This was one they did earlier as a test. You can start doing those deployments. And the deployments go through and they, pull the image down. If you have an image builder process, it can be part of that process where you do any maybe patch installs or any other special configurations as part of the deployment. But it just says a basic image deployment, and then you can just add it into the environment. And then if you want to, we talked about you want to do additional applications, you'll see here created the desktop group for that one. If I want to create a new application group of just my basic tools. And if you don't assign users to it, they won't ever see it. So you want to assign users. Now, with again the spring update, you can actually do groups. That was a big pain point for a while, but you now actually add groups. But your applications, what it'll actually do is it'll connect back to the first running system. So if you have a -0 and the first one that's usually deploying the host pool, it's going to log into that agent and ask, okay, what's in the start menu, and it will list off all the applications that it sees in the start menu. And so you can pick through one of those. So if you want to do something like a task manager, and it pulls with the application, the icon, all that fun stuff. If you want to put command line parameters in the end of it, you could. Just do that. And if you want to add another application, and say you want to do something like Notepad, and then again, if you don't want to register with the desktop or with the workspace, you can, but because this host pool is already a member workspace, you can only do that. All right. View and create. Maybe come back over to here. Should I actually complete it though? All right. All right. Application group is now done. Now if I come over to here, refresh this view, you'll see you now have the Notepad and Task Manager because I was added to the application group. So that's as quickly as you can do that. And again, with that same type of setup with the MSIX app-attach, you could set up the app-attach to be an application that you put on here. And so if you have a new application, you put the app-attach out in the share, you create a app group, put the application shortcut, whatever it needs to be to launch that app-attach, and you put it in here. And then that's all you have to do for the deployment for the MSIX. Okay, well, again, just kind of go over what we've gone through. We have the virtual desktop overview, what was kind of the history of VDI, the Windows virtual desktop structure, what the different pieces are in there, the WVD deployment methods, as well as what the future holds. We went through a brief demo, just kind of showing you the different environments. Does anybody have any questions before we close out? All right. Well, since I don't see any questions, thank you very much for listening to this expert talk. Again, my name is Kit Skinner, and this has been a presentation of the Skill Me Up training. feel free to look out at any of our other courses. Thank you all.